All right, here we are, lecture number 2, which I'm going to upload in 4 parts. One dealing with the Washington administration, the second dealing with the Adams administration, the third, the Jefferson administration, and the fourth, the Madison administration, which encompasses also the War of 1812. That will move us all the way through the end of chapter 8 before our second test. Remember, this lecture is going to be covered on that second test, which I will upload to you not long after I post the videos. There will be no objective portion to that test because you will be answering the objective portion by sending in your responses to the questions that I'm asking at the end of the lectures. Those will all add up to be the objective portion of the exam. The essays will require you to do the same thing that you did on the first test. You will have a choice of 2 essays to write on. You will, however, this time around, type up your essays and email them to me. They can only be a single page long, which of course allows you to say a lot more than you can writing it out in longhand under the pressure of time. These will be open book essays. So you can consult the notes, you consult the video lectures, you can consult your book in order to write a good essay. Of course, I will expect grammar, spelling, punctuation to be correct, so use your spell check, use your grammar check on the computer, and I will have a higher bar for accuracy because you are taking an open book test. So the standard for performance here is going to go up because the complexity of what you're being asked to do is being simplified since you are going to have up to a week to give me your answers. There has been a question that's been asked by some of your fellow students about how quickly I want answers to the questions at the end of each video lecture, and the answer is I want you to see these video lectures within the week after they are posted, so you have until the next lecture to watch those videos and send in your answers, okay? I won't hold everybody hard and fast to that on the first one, but from this point forward, that will be our standard, okay? So always feel free to ask questions. I know that this is kind of strange and new to all of us. I'm going to be doing some experimentation with this lecture, so I'm going to put this up as a podcast in case you have a hard time watching the video or you just don't like watching the video. I'm also going to, again, try to incorporate some pictures. We'll see how that works. It's very time consuming, so I don't know that I'll be able to do it for every single lecture, or every single part of every lecture. I'm going to make the attempt to make this a little bit more than just a talking head, all right? So again, remember you can ask questions by email. Let's stay in contact with each other since we're not getting to see each other once a week. Take care of yourselves, that's all important, and we will go forward from here. So we're going to start now part 1 of our second lecture, and that's going to deal with the immediate aftermath of the constitutional ratification. So we have a brand new constitution. It is a constitution that vastly strengthens the central government, specifies its powers. It now can levy taxes, it can impose tariffs, it can regulate interstate commerce, it can pass laws with the authority to impose its will on the states. But of course, there were all kinds of questions that were going to be asked in this new environment, and those questions were pretty fundamental. Was this new constitution going to work? Was this new constitution going to see one branch of the federal government dominate the other 2, the executive branch possibly dominating the judicial and the legislature? Or would it be the legislature dominating the judicial and the executive? Or would the executive and the judicial team up to dominate the legislative? Nobody really knew. This had never been done before. Would the central government really prove more powerful than the state governments? That was the idea, but was it actually going to work in practice? What was the nature of this new presidency going to be? We decided to have a one-man chief executive. Was that going to go go sideways very quickly. Again, you were going to have to wait and see. And then there were the fundamental questions that always show up when you have a new administration. And those are questions about policy. What kind of economic policy, diplomatic policy, military policy is this administration going to have? And so all of that remained to be seen. There was, of course, only one choice for the presidency of the United States, and that was George Washington. And he was unanimously elected by the Electoral College. He will be reelected 4 years later in the same fashion, the only person to ever receive the unanimous vote of the Electoral College. There have been a couple of presidents who've come close, but nobody's actually achieved that since Washington, and it's unlikely that anyone ever will. So if you have a system where the person who gets the most electoral votes becomes president, and the person who gets the second most electoral votes becomes vice president, and Washington got all the votes the first time, well, you have to have a second ballot to determine who the vice president is going to be, and John Adams of Massachusetts was selected. So we have a Southerner, Washington, from Virginia as president. We have a New Englander, Adams from Massachusetts, as vice president. And that kind of sets up a trend that's going to continue for a while, that you're going to have one president from one section and the vice president from another section of the country, kind of creating a little bit of a balance, if you prefer to look at it that way. And so these are the two elected officials. And of course, we have a brand new Congress. That Congress has already gotten very busy. So it had drafted and sent out to the states for ratification the original Bill of Rights, which we remember were ratified. It repasses the Land Ordinance of 1785. It repasses the Northwest Ordinance, so they're now codified under law as part of the new constitutional government. It creates the judiciary as required. The national judiciary is required by the Constitution. And it also creates the departments of the federal government. So we get a Department of State, we get a Department of War, we get a Department of Treasury. And the Constitution laid all of that out and said that the people appointed to those posts must be by the president, nominated by the president, must be approved by the Senate. And of course, that was going to happen fairly easily. And so Washington had the great benefit of being able to select from some very talented men who had played critical roles in the American Revolution. So as his Secretary of the Treasury, he selected Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Jefferson, remember, is the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He had been governor of Virginia in the latter part of the Revolutionary War, and then he had gone on to become the United States ambassador to France. And so he was not at the Constitutional Convention. This is something a lot of people often forget. Jefferson wasn't part of that body that crafted the Constitution. He was in Paris at the time, and actually kind of reluctant to leave Paris to come back to the United States, but Washington prevailed upon him and he agreed, so he comes back and he becomes the Secretary of State. As Secretary of War, Washington selected Henry Knox. Henry Knox, who had commanded the artillery of the Continental Army throughout the war. Henry Knox, the guy who drug all those cannon through the snowy wilderness of upstate New York from Fort Ticonderoga so that Washington could drive the British out of Boston in early 1776. He becomes the Secretary of War. And then as Secretary of the Treasury, we get Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is, of course, from New York City. Although he was not born in America, he was born in the West Indies and came to America as a young teenager. Hamilton had been one of Washington's key aides during a good part of the Revolutionary War. He'd gone on to command one of the most important assaults on the British defenses at Yorktown, and we know that he had played a big role at the Constitutional Convention, where his proposal for an elective monarchy had helped to save the Virginia plan when it was threatened by the New Jersey plan. And so Hamilton is now the Secretary of the Treasury. So this new government gets up, it gets operating. It's a very small government, very small. The administration of our campus at ACC is probably larger than the number of personnel who were in that first administration under George Washington. But a couple of very important things happen under Washington's administration very, very early on. First off, Washington sets the proper tone. He's dignified, he's respectful, he's willing to work with the judicial and the legislative branches of government, but he's going to make the presidency a position of real power, real authority, while not making it a position that resembles anything like a dictator or a king. And a symbol of how Washington was going to sort of take a humble approach is his vote for how the chief executive should be addressed. This was actually a question. What are you going to call the president when he's introduced? There were all kinds of proposals, and he shied away from things like Your Highness, Your Excellency, and he put his stamp down on the idea that he simply be called Mr. President. Mr. President, it's a simple job title. It confers nothing about being regal or sovereign or more special than the ordinary citizen. He's just the guy who temporarily has the job. The other thing that Washington does is to create the first presidential cabinet. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. Washington, as president, appoints the people who will run the departments of the federal government created by the Congress, but he, having been a general, was used to having councils of war, bringing all of his generals in with him and getting their advice, sharing his plans, talking things through, and he's going to continue that as president. And of course, he's got brilliant men to work with, Hamilton and Jefferson and Knox, and so he forms them into a close-knit group of advisors that come to be known as the cabinet. And because Washington has a cabinet, every president since has had a cabinet. It's the first thing that people ask when somebody gets elected to the presidency. Who's going to be in your cabinet? Who are going to be your principal advisors? And this highlights the fact that everything that Washington does is establishing a precedent. He's doing it for the first time, and then that's going to become the norm, the expectation for how it's going to be done forever after. And even though this small government is not large in terms of personnel or expenditure, it's getting things done. We've already seen Congress pass several important laws, but take Jefferson's State Department, for example. The official staff of the State Department, if we exclude ambassadors overseas, consisted of Jefferson, 2 clerks, 2 assistant clerks, and 1 part-time translator. So the entire State Department structure in the capital, which originally was New York, and then would become Philadelphia while we were building a new capital city for the new government under the new Constitution. The entire State Department consists of 5.5 people, and even then it was able to conduct not only America's foreign policy, but it also oversaw the first census of the United States, which is required by the Constitution. We're going to take a physical count of the American people and figure out how many of them are in each state, and that is important because that's how you determine representation in the House of Representatives, the lower branch of the Congress, and of course that is also going to play a role in apportioning the electoral votes of the states for the Electoral College and the creation, or rather the election of the president. Now, we have a new government, but the problems are old. And of course, the most pressing problem that the United States faced was an economic problem. The country, in many ways, is created because of economic crisis. And that had led to the Annapolis Convention, that had led to the Philadelphia Convention, and economic problems and taxation had created things like Shays' Rebellion and this sort of thing. And so getting the country's economic house in order was extremely important for the new government. And to do that, Washington turned toward Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, which of course makes a great deal of sense. Hamilton was a very smart fellow, he was sophisticated. He was, remember, a man for whom the phrase, the ends justify the means, was very appropriate, and Hamilton immediately proposed a series of federal actions that would right the economic ship of state. And he laid these out beginning in the January of 1790 and sort of rolled them out over the next couple of years. But the proposals were actually very straightforward. And the first thing he proposed to do was to fully fund the federal debt. The second thing he proposed was that the federal government assume the debts, at least the war debts, of the 13 states Then he proposed the creation of a national bank, and finally, the implementation of a protective tariff. And all of these proposals turned out to be very controversial. There are people who didn't like them for a variety of reasons. They caused a great deal of debate in the Congress. The idea of fully funding the federal debt seems straightforward, but in fact it wasn't. The United States government had a debt of $54 million, and that was the inherited debt, if you will, from the Revolutionary War, Second Continental Congress, and the government under the Articles of Confederation. And a lot of that $54 million was owed to people who had bought government bonds. So the $54 million, $40 million was in the form of bonds that were about to come due and would have to be paid off. And most of you have probably at one time or another gotten a savings bond from a grandparent or something like that. And you know that you do not purchase a savings bond or any kind of treasury bond or government bond at its full value. You pay less, and let's keep it really simple. Let's say you pay half. So you're gonna buy a $10 bond, you pay $5 for it. Now, when you buy that bond, essentially what you're doing is giving a loan to the government. You're giving the government $5 today that it can use to do things, and in exchange for that loan, the government is saying that if you keep the bond until it matures in, say, like 10 or 15 years, we are not only gonna give you your $5 back, we're going to give you a guaranteed profit of another $5. So I buy the bond for $5, I keep it for 10 years, it matures, and when I cash it in, I get $10. That's why bonds are attractive, because you can do something patriotic, lend some money to the government to meet current needs, and you will not only be sure to get your money back, you have a guaranteed profit, not based on interest rates or anything like that. You know what you're going to get. And in order to finance the Revolutionary War, and in order to finance the government under the Confederation, the U.S. had sold a lot of these bonds. But of course, the problem with these bonds during the Revolutionary War and the period of the Confederation was, first, the economy got worse and worse and worse as time rolled on. The situation of the United States often looked precarious, and if the United States lost the Revolutionary War, if the Congress, the Confederation couldn't hold things together and the country collapsed, then there would be no government to pay off those bonds, and that meant you would never get to cash them in. The money that you had invested in them was gone. The potential profit that you had supposedly been guaranteed was gone. And in that crisis, a lot of people had decided to sell their bonds. And they sold their bonds to speculators. These were people who had cash, who were looking for a deal. They were willing to buy those bonds at a discount. So you bought the bond at $5. They say, well, I can't give you $5, I'll give you $2. You get $2 in your hand now to feed your family or pay your taxes or something like that. It means that I'm assuming the risk. I'm assuming the risk that the government's still going to be around when this bond matures, and I can cash it in and get my investment back and the guaranteed profit. And a lot of people had sold their bonds under these circumstances. When the Continental Army was discharged following the ratification of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the soldiers were paid in bonds. But young men needing to get on with their life couldn't wait for 10 years for these bonds to mature. And so they sold them to speculators. And as a consequence of that, of the 20,000 people who held these bonds, so it's a tiny percentage of the population. You get 2 million people in the United States, only 20,000 of them actually hold these bonds. Only 20% of those were the actual purchasers, the original purchasers of the bonds. So you have a large amount of money that's going to come due very quickly, and you're going to have to pay it to speculators. And there were people in the Congress and in the press who said, well, we should do that. These people had taken advantage of the soldiers when they were discharged. They'd taken advantage of the good farmer and townsman during the Revolutionary War. This is a new government. Should we bankrupt it at the very beginning to pay off this debt, to run up by two governments that no longer exist. And should we absolutely do that to pay the likes of these speculators who have gamed the system? So why not pass a law just obliterating the debt? We're the government. We could do that. Why not pass a law saying we're only going to honor bonds that are held by the original purchasers? We could do that and thus vastly eliminate or reduce the debt. And Hamilton argued in his full funding proposal that that was, one, immoral, and then secondly, it was a horrible idea. First off, these bonds are payable to the bearer, and that meant that the original purchaser could sell them if they wanted. They could make a good deal, they could make a bad deal. It was their choice in their circumstances, and so if they had decided to sell them, that was a legal transaction, and the speculators who had bought them had assumed risk. That risk was now going to pay off, and they were standing to make a handsome profit, but there was nothing illegal about that either. And so beyond the fact that this was all legal and beyond the fact that morally you should pay your debts, Hamilton also argued that in the future the government was going to have to sell bonds, and for all kinds of reasons, but perhaps to fund another war with England. Nobody thought England was done with us, and so we're going to fight them again. And as a consequences of that, you had better be able to sell bonds. But if you're going to come in now and say, well, we've decided that we don't want to honor those bonds, or you come in now and you say that, well, we don't like you, so we're not going to pay you, we're going to pay these people we do like, who would want to buy your bond in the future? And the answer, of course, is probably nobody. And if nobody wants to buy your bonds, you can't raise money selling those bonds, and that's going to be very bad in some future crisis. And that logic prevailed, and Hamilton got full funding through the Congress, and Washington signed it into law. His next proposal is assumption of state war debt by the federal government. Collectively, the states owe $25 million. So their collective debt was almost half of what the national debt was. And what Hamilton proposes is that the federal government take on those state war debts and pay them off. And this would, of course, be a great relief on the budgets of the states. And so why would a state object? Well, there were objections, and the objections came from two places. First off, some states had worked very hard to pay off their debt, and they had suffered great pain in the process of doing that, and other states hadn't. And of course, if the federal government assumes those states' debts, it's going to use federal revenue drawn from the federal treasury to do it, and that means that the states who had not taken care of their business, so to speak, were going to benefit from not having done it, and the states that had taken care of their debt were basically going to be penalized for it. You hear echoes of this argument today when there are political proposals to forgive student debt. And one of the objections to that is, well, is that fair to the people who, worked their way through college, whose parents saved carefully and paid their way or have paid off their debt, so they worked hard, they were responsible, they did the right thing, they took care of their debt, and the people who traveled a different path are now going to benefit using tax dollars that are in part drawn from people who had done the responsible thing, had taken care of the expenses as they went along. And so you have, for the first time, this argument show up in the national debate over whether or not the national government, the federal government, can pick winners and losers. Can it undertake a policy that benefits one group of people at a harm to another group of people? So there was sort of a philosophical component to that argument, but there was also a political component, because a lot of state governments suspected that Hamilton wasn't just being altruistic here. What Hamilton is doing by assuming state debts is he's removing the state's voice in national economic policy, because if the federal government is the only one that holds substantial debt, then the federal government is the only one that has leverage to say, hey, this is what we got to do. If the states don't owe any debt, they're not going to be impacted by those decisions, and therefore they don't really have any leverage. And so there was opposition, but once again, Hamilton was able to make the case. It passes the Congress, and Washington signs it into law. So 2 at-bats, 2 home runs for Alexander Hamilton. Now we come to his third proposal, and that is the creation of a national bank. that would be modeled more or less after the National Bank of England. This would be a federal institution that would not be just a single building, although it would have a headquarters in New York, but there would be mints, there would be the ability to coin money, to print paper money. This would be the avenue by which the government sold bonds, collected taxes and tariff revenues. It would be the principal instrument for the government to influence the economy. And Hamilton thought that was a really good idea. There were those who disagreed. A lot of Americans did not interact with banks. In fact, probably most Americans did not interact with banks, and many of them didn't understand banks or finance, and there was something that was sort of suspicious about banks. You know, most people worked and made a living by the sweat of their brow. They grew things, they made things, they dug ditches, they sailed ships, and that sort of thing. Whereas the banker sits in his office with that little green visor pulled down over his head, and he works with pen and paper, and he uses other people's money to make money for himself. And some people consider that to be kind of an immoral way of making a living. There was an even greater fear that a national bank would be manipulated by the moneyed interest in the country, the economic elite of the nation, who were as close to an American aristocracy as you were going to get. They would have the know-how and the connections and the influence to be the managers of the bank, to be the employees of the bank, and they would look out for their own self-interest, even if that was detrimental to the common folk or to the country at large. And so there was a great fear of corruption. And remember, this is one of the lessons that Americans carry out of the Revolutionary War. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So anything that concentrates power makes Americans post-revolution very nervous. Those arguments aside, Hamilton managed to ram this thing through the Congress. And so a law is passed creating a national bank for a trial period of 20 years. So we're not committing to it forever. We're saying we're going to give it 20 years, and at the end of those 20 years, we'll evaluate. Did this work, not work? Are we happy with it? Do we need to make changes? And we'll go from there. So a 20-year trial. And that bill lines up on Washington's desk, and Washington has to decide what to do. And remember that presidents do not make laws. Presidents do not pass taxes. That's what the Congress does. Presidents can propose, presidents can champion, presidents can suggest, but at the end of the day, the only power that a president really has is to sign or to veto legislation. And Washington had to make a decision, and that decision was a little bit more difficult than one might have imagined because he had two brilliant men giving him completely opposite advice. And Alexander Hamilton, of course, who was the brainchild of a national bank, was urging Washington to sign the legislation, and Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State and the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was telling him not to sign. And here we have now a dividing line, philosophical dividing line, that is beginning to appear in the country, because what Hamilton is arguing is that the United States needs to develop a complex economy, an economy of towns and cities, farms and factories. We need to economically be able to stand alone and to take care of all of our needs, and a national bank is an important tool in being able to do that. It's an important tool in being able to defend the country in wartime by making it easier to sell bonds and bring in revenues and these sorts of things. But Jefferson disagreed. He thought that the United States should remain a simple economy, primarily rural, because if a man owned his own land, he worked for himself, he was his own boss, and therefore he could make his own political decisions. Whereas if you get people working in factories and businesses, then they work for somebody else, and the interest of the business or the factory or the firm becomes the dominant factor in their political decision making. And Jefferson believed you start to crowd people into cities and you get all the vice and the corruption that goes with cities. So better to remain rural and agricultural, get our industrial needs mostly from Europe, and therefore something like a national bank wasn't required. But there was an even more fundamental argument between Hamilton and Jefferson over the question of the national bank. And that stemmed from the issue of its constitutionality. And what Thomas Jefferson tells Washington is that he cannot sign the bill creating a national bank because to do so would violate the Constitution. It would be unconstitutional. So here you are, the Constitution is less than 5 years old, and we are already having an argument over what it means, what it says. The men who wrote it, who ratified it, who argued over it, are still there, and they're already arguing over what exactly the Constitution means. And basically, Jefferson is taking what is considered to be a strict interpretation of the Constitution or a narrow construction of the Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution lays out the powers of the Congress. It gives it the power to make war. It gives it the power to conduct diplomacy, to regulate interstate commerce, to impose taxes and tariffs. It gives it the power to do all sorts of things, but there's a specified list of powers. And what Jefferson says is nowhere in that specified list is there a sentence that says you can create a national bank. And unless that sentence is there, you can't do it. And therefore, creating a national bank would be unconstitutional. And this is an argument for a very confined set of powers for the national government. We want to keep as tight a rein on the national government as we possibly can. Hamilton counters that not only is a national bank a good idea, it is perfectly constitutional. And he points to Section 8 of Article 2, where at the end of this long list of specified powers, things Congress can do, is a phrase or a clause that says that the Congress can make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its specified powers. And so Congress can make any law that it considers necessary and proper to wage war, to regulate interstate commerce, to print money, to levy taxes and tariffs. And Hamilton tells Washington a national bank is necessary and it is proper to carrying out a whole bunch of the functions the Constitution gives the Congress. And in making this argument, Hamilton has therefore brought into the spotlight one of the most expansive parts of the Constitution, and that is the necessary and proper clause, or sometimes called the elastic clause. It is the single largest grant of power to the national government in the Constitution. And you see, the Founding Fathers hoped to create a government that would last forever. And therefore, they knew that the Constitution would have to be something that would work for the future as well as for the present. And they could envision the necessity of the national government having to do things like regulate trade, collect tariffs and taxes, wage war, that sort of stuff. And they said, here's the big job that we want the national government to do. Anything that falls outside this list is the purview of the states or the people, and that's codified in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. But we know that we're not always going to be able to forecast what will be necessary and proper to wage a war, to regulate interstate commerce, and these sorts of things. And so we're telling Congress, here's the big job, and you can do whatever you need to do to get that big job done. And therefore, you're giving the Congress an enormous amount of flexibility. And this is today the justification for most of the things that the national government does. The Founding Fathers could have never envisioned the need for the United States to have a space program, to build an interstate highway system, to respond to a pandemic, to build an atomic bomb in order to win a world war, or to regulate air traffic safety, or to give loans to college students who wish to further their education. The Founding Fathers, therefore, didn't attempt to imagine a list and make it. They said, here are the big ideas, and you can do whatever's necessary to accomplish the big ideas. And, of course, Hamilton is perfectly right. The elastic clause makes it constitutional to create a national bank, and he convinced Washington, and he signed the national bank into law. Hamilton's third proposal, or rather his fourth proposal for an elective for a protective tariff, did not go so well. And the reason for that is pretty much political. So again, keeping with the theme that Hamilton believes we need to have a complex economy that is self-sufficient. That means that we have to develop American industry. The problem with developing American industry is that we have been reliant from the very beginning on the industry of England. And for a long time due to English law, but even after the revolution is over and peace is signed, we're still primarily an agricultural country. We're sending our agricultural produce